Welcome to the Financial Thought Exchange, where you get to learn from the biggest and brightest mind in finance. We are here at the CFA Institute Annual Conference in Chicago. And right now I am sitting down with Peter Lazaroff. Welcome.
Lada, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. We're on the panel, so we want to see how your feelings are after that. But just as an introduction, Peter Lazaroff, he's the author of the book Making Money Simple, and also the Chief Investment Officer at Plancorp, a national wealth management firm with $7 billion in asset under management. There he's responsible for overseeing the development, implementation, and communication of investment strategy. Peter is also the host of the Long-Term Investor podcast, of which I am a big fan. You're doing a great job there, so congrats to that.
Thank you. You're actually quite brave. When I have a guest on the show, I'm always afraid to read their introduction. I trip up over the things and I don't want them to think I don't care about their accomplishments. And so at the beginning of every episode, if any of the listeners are going to go and listen to the Long-Term Investor, they'll hear me read an intro in advance because I just get too nervous in front of my guests. So I thought you did a lovely job just now.
Now you all know it's all pre-recorded. Nothing is pre-recorded here. So you just came from a panel, so you're doing one thing after the other here. What did you take away from the panel, and what do you hope that the audience took away from your remarks there?
Sure. Well, selfish plug for my own podcast. If you're listening to us, that session will go live on my podcast May 28th. So you can go to the longterminvestor.com. You can subscribe there wherever you want to listen and catch up. It was Decoding Investor Behavior. So thinking about behavioral finance in a way to help us not just make better investment decisions, but to help coach clients along the way into making better decisions, or at least feeling more confident, more content within their personal lives. And my guest was Brian Portnoy, who is the founder of Shaping Wealth. They actually do some work with Plancorp, the firm where I'm the chief investment officer, that does a lot of coaching for our advisors, because I think behavioral finance is fascinating. It's something that I didn't really get in school. And the CFA curriculum, when I took it decades ago, let's say, maybe not decades plural, but maybe 15 years ago, there was a little bit of discussion of the different biases more in a definitional manner. But I always found the space so fascinating. And I think we all have to some extent. It's fun to see what us silly little humans do on a regular basis, and reading a behavioral finance experiment allows you to relate to it and say, oh yeah, that does happen to me. I have thought that way. But I also think that behavioral finance is ready to move forward from just identifying the biases and even trying to minimize them. I think taking the human out of human behavior is not really going to be an effective strategy for a lot of people. So what does behavioral finance 2.0 look like, and how can we move in that direction?
I definitely want to pick your brain on that. So when we study for the CFA exams, you learn about those. And as you say, you can take from that what you want as an asset manager. But it's a whole different story, right? When we're talking about in the wealth management space, you have a client who does something else in the regular job. They're not an investment professional. So I guess that it's a very different kind of approach there, how you educate, and then how much are you trying to force them to do the right thing, so to speak, versus realizing that they're making a mistake and hope that they can kind of see into themselves and therefore correct some behavior.
Well, and what's interesting, at least about my role, is oftentimes I'm speaking directly to the end client. Oftentimes I'm speaking to the advisor who covers their own, they're humans too, last time I checked, so they have their own biases and cognitive misunderstandings. And then I chair the investment committee where we make group decisions. And making a decision as a single individual is already hard enough to do effectively and not let bias and error drift into it. Making a decision as a group is an entirely little different animal. And so I think what was fun about the session I held, one is that it was on the big stage. So I was like, oh, well, that's kind of fun. I'm on a giant screen. I don't know that I've ever done that before. But two, being able to speak to the many different types of CFA charter holders have in the audience, as well as the candidates. Because I think when you're a CFA candidate, you maybe have a general idea of what you'd like to do. But the curriculum is just one piece of all of it. And it is a very important signaling tool. It signals to employers that you are self-motivated and driven and can follow instructions and can do good work and work hard. But also it provides a foundation to build on top of. And so I'm curious, I could talk in either direction if you want to hear more about client interactions or internal or broader thoughts on investor behavior. But you tell me what's most interesting.
Well, I would like to hit on a couple of specific topics since you are so well versed into this space. If I think about education of your clients being high net worth individuals or any savers, how do you we have this trend now. We have a big development ahead of us, which is a big transfer of wealth from the baby boomer generations to young and older millennials. What is the implication there for education for your clients when you have that shift? And how do you educate? Are you educating them differently and at the same time?
You know what's interesting for me? So I'm an older millennial, and I'm often the mouthpiece for our organization that has clients across the age spectrum. And I remember a decade ago when I had a similar role of being the mouthpiece, but I didn't necessarily have the job title that matched it, where it was tough to speak to an older generation and have them say, well, what do you know about that? You're just a kid, or you haven't experienced this. I think in general, the process of education is similar across the board. The message doesn't really change. I think it's where do you meet that individual? And so it used to be once upon a time that people read things. And as a result, I had a blog. I was a contributor at Wall Street Journal and Forbes. As you mentioned, I have a book. I'm actually in the process of writing another book now, despite the fact that I feel that people don't read yet. They do, but just not that much. And so you might be able to reach a baby boomer client better with an article than you can a podcast or a YouTube video or TikTok. I have not gone down the rabbit hole too far of social media and education, but for me, it is always educate and always empathize. So when I get a question from a client or an advisor, my immediate thought is that question is held by other people. So when I answer it, you need to answer it in varying degrees of complexity. There's kind of like this base level, like if I only have 60 seconds, and if I were shooting a TikTok video, which I don't do, but could I do it? Could I answer the question in 60 seconds? Then if I have 5 minutes, how do I answer that question? And then if I have time to write a full article on it, how does that engage? And so it's really just communicating in different channels and in different short form, long form, middle form. And that tends to reach across different generations, different age brackets. But one thing I will note, though, is I feel that millennials, more so than Gen X when I work with them, and I don't have a great read on Gen Z yet in terms of like clientele. We have some children of clients who are already wealthy in their own right, but I can't quite solve this. But I will say millennials are very up for like making fun of other generations and making fun of parents, whereas I get the sense that baby boomers are not as up for making fun of their kids or other generations. There's a lot of pride in there. And so I think there are things over time that you pick up on where perhaps the stories you're telling or the ways that you're trying to relate with an individual so that you're able to convey some information, it is pretty important.
I feel like there are two dimensions of this. Like one is generational ages that we hit on. The other one is also this, have I made my own money versus inherited wealth? And I guess that the attitude to the wealth that you're having is different, right? 100%. And that therefore their advisory becomes different.
Well, in a business, if you started a business and that's where you got your wealth, you're very comfortable taking risk. If you inherited your wealth and never really had to take any life risks or career risks, suddenly losing that wealth is going to be a different problem in your head and approached differently. And one of the interesting things, even about the session I just did on behavioral finance, is that especially CFA charter holders, we are trained to want to solve the problem, to collect data. But what we need to do as advisors really is invite in conversation. And our brains actually, when we get emotional, don't really cognitively process information correctly to begin with. So the conversation has to actually shift towards a how are you doing or a tell me more about that situation. We say hugs before hugs before facts. Make sure that you're addressing those actual human needs. And then you can provide the information that will allow people either to do the right thing, to stay the course, or just to feel comfortable with their plan in the first place.
It's an interesting expression, hug before facts. It's like, give me the facts, and you're like, gotta pay tax.
Yes, you have to get a hug rate first. I don't really hug my clients. There's a few who I'm friends with, though. I suppose they're available for hugging.
But so your firm emphasizes the avoiding of making mistake more than getting it perfectly right?
Yeah.
How do you think about just say it like this, what are the mistakes that you end up spending most energy and time on to mitigate among your clients?
That's a really interesting question. Let me reaffirm what you said. Yes, I'm far more concerned about like implementing a bad idea than missing out on a good one. That lens through which I see the work really influences how we choose to do something or not do something with the portfolio. Because generally speaking, there's lots of great products out there. There's lots of great back tests. We all have the same data set, but within that data set, it's kind of like when the FDA is approving a drug, they will, approve some drugs, but it's a really rigorous process because they don't want to have bad side effects with it. Inclusion for a portfolio is exactly the same. And for those who are in the middle of their curriculum, that's type 1 and type 2 error. I'm all for minimizing type 1 error. Now, that if you just minimize type 1 error, you just own a broad set of index funds and do nothing else. Nothing else is good enough. And I'm not sure I'm really like there, because when you minimize one error, you increase the chances of accepting a second. It's a balance, but I am more concerned about missing out. I'm more concerned about implementing a bad idea than I am missing out on a good one. So I have 10,000 no's to every yes. But the mistake that drives me nuts, the thing that causes the most problem and is hardest to clean up, is not a bad investment decision. It's setting the wrong expectations. So I inherited a portfolio, an investment committee, a role. My firm has been in business for over 40 years now. And while the philosophy has remained the same, the expectations for a strategy like factor investing, for example, we have a pretty noticeable value bias in our portfolios. And when anybody who is listening to this, who has seen any sort of the research on owning value versus growth or cheap versus expensive, will know, oh, wow, those are really big win rates. And it wins a lot. But for something that maybe even wins in 80% of 10-year periods, just understanding, well, what does that mean? Is that the data that a lot of people going around even still show long-short data? We're only in long-only portfolios. So the differences are bigger. They're showing average returns instead of annualized returns. So when you show a compound return, it's going to look different than the average return. This is why our CFA charters are so important, is that you start to ask questions and look at the data. And I think the difference between expectations and reality is happiness. And if it's very wide, there's going to be very unhappy people. So you have to keep expectations. It's not about setting them low, but I think it's explaining not just to your clients, but to your advisors, to your committee members, to anybody who's a stakeholder in an investment decision. That is probably, when you say what's the worst thing to clean up, I can't clean up expectations that have been set for decades before me. I couldn't control how expectations are set going forward. And anytime I feel that you deviate from a market portfolio or you own anything other than just a broad set of indexes, you really have to start setting expectations for what that means. Why are you doing it? You're doing it because the average person holds the average portfolio, which is the market portfolio, and you're different than average. You and I, Lotta, are both different than average. So should we hold the market portfolio, or do we have things about our lives or our income streams or our tolerance of risk that allows us to deviate from average? And that's all fine, except what can go wrong. To talk about what can go wrong, I think a great example of where people are going to get burned is like private equity and private credit. I think that people are too aggressively putting those into their portfolios with the wrong set of expectations. So to be clear, I'm not saying, you should be in private markets at all, but I am not sure that, well, let me be clear. I don't think that the advisors are very clear on what the case is and what the dispersion looks like. But that means then that the clients don't have the right expectations either. And so like expectations and attaching investments to goals, if that isn't done, that is a big mess to clean up. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question.
It's helpful. And by the way, if the audience wants to hear all the pros and cons of private equity, another episode is also from this conference that we talk about private equity that we did this morning. Now, just to get back to that, about what you mean by the cost of setting the wrong expectations. Do you mean by that the fact that you're looking at your clients and they're unhappy and you're thinking about is the utility curve kind of being lower, or is it a matter of that they end up firing you, or that they end up making just changes in the portfolio in the last minute? Often it's going to be that last minute, the worst kind of trades that you can make because they have their wrong expectations.
I think really you said it best as you were asking the question, was that you tend to make these changes at the absolute worst times.
Yeah. So how do you deal with the risk aversion and calibrate that of your clients where you're talking about mostly passive, approaches that you have here? Do you put your clients in different risk buckets and therefore have different allocations? Is that how you do it, or how do you think about risk generally otherwise?
That's a great question, Lada. I think, so for context, our equity portfolios, all the strategies are rules-based. There's really no traditional active management that relies on market timing or security selection. But in our fixed income portfolios, all we use is active management, some of which is rules-based and quantitative driven, some of which is that traditional market timing and security selection nature. And so there is some, on the equity side is where there's more collaboration, like which form of rules-based investing works best for you. Is it index? Is it factor? Is it ESG? Is it something that kind of mixes some of them? And then it's a matter of what's your stocks and bonds split, because at the end of the day, the stock bond split is going to define how variable returns are going to be, and trying to find that right place, build a financial plan, try to find that right balance of risk, and then implement the strategies. But where I think, the buckets of risk are a little different is that in the fixed income portfolio, if you're in an 80-20 portfolio, 80% stocks, 20% bonds, your risks are very different than somebody who is in a 20% stock, 80% bond portfolio. So like the 80-20, the 50-50, the 20-80, they all have very different needs. Like the 20-80 portfolio, inflation is a big risk. That fixed income is going to look a little bit different. In the 80-20 portfolio, inflation is really no risk because you have so many stocks that will outpace inflation. As an example, there's also decent research that shows that the volatility of bonds in a portfolio like that largely don't matter. And so a lot of people would argue that you should own even riskier debt and even longer duration debt in that type of portfolio. So in terms of like risk bucketing, I think that's where portfolio design probably shows strongest in our platform. But beyond that, the main thing that a client's risk profile is going to align with is just their stock bond split. The one other thing I'll note, so we typically won't do any sort of alternatives or private investments. I publicly say $20 million and up. Sometimes we'll let a client with like maybe 10-ish million go ahead and do it. But generally speaking, that is the thing that I'm looking for with that client is an overweight of liquidity. So like if you have what's overweight liquidity, if you have $20 million and you're 80 years old, you probably are not going to spend all that money. Now you might argue your horizon's not long because you might die. So maybe I just worked against myself there, but your horizon's that of the next generation. Yeah. Maybe if I bring it back to somebody in their 60s, they know they're overweight liquidity. They're not going to need all the money anytime soon. They can then align some of the investments to not be so overweight in liquidity, and perhaps, here's where expectation setting comes, perhaps, but not definitely, improve the overall return or diversification. Emphasis on perhaps, though.
Yeah. It does sound like you have quite a personalized approach in that way. Like you take a.
I think that we're as personalized as a firm our size could be. Everybody, in generally fits into big buckets, but I think that there's a level of customization again where, we go back to the buying a suit or a jacket and having a custom made. I don't know that like having different buttons or different like stitching on the inseam, even on a tailored jacket, a tailor is going to stitch in their patch the same way, whether they do for everybody. So I think there's still some areas where it's like, there's certain truths in investing and exposures in investing that don't need to be that customized. From there, though, the tools, like if I know I need total market exposure, that's where you get more customization because maybe you're an executive with a ton of individual stock. And so we have exchange funds, or we use options collars to create the synthetic exposure, or, separately managed accounts, we know we need losses. And so there can be a little bit more customization down at the individual level once it's attacking a certain market exposure itself.
Right. Considering then in the end, your focus on avoiding mistakes in the educational part. Now, behavioral finance has been around for a while now. People have been trying to prevent their clients from making mistakes. Are we doing something wrong since we keep having to educate and we keep seeing those mistakes? Are we seeing the same mistakes all over? And is there some approach that is missing here or that you see lacking out there?
I don't think, the one thing that's interesting is when you look back at history and all the manias and the bubbles and what people have done, like history, I think it's the Mark Twain quote where like history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, something like that. We're never going to get rid of behavioral errors, and people are always going to be fearful or greedy. And I think those sort of tendencies are always going to persist. There are more tools than ever to have help with that, whether it's an advisor, whether it's a digital advisor or a hybrid advisor. Perhaps we'll get to a point where people can rely on AI for their portfolio the way that they rely on like a Waymo, like the self-driving Uber for a ride from the airport. Now, if I had to get in a self-driving Uber right now to the airport or here in Chicago, I don't think I'm getting in. That's too complicated of a drive. If I'm driving from my house to my office in a self-driving car, a drive that I know pretty well and isn't that risky, yeah, I'd be up for it. I'm not feeling great about it, but I'd be up for it. With behavioral stuff, I think in general, people might look to technology as the solve for that. I think until we're ready to be performed surgery on, diagnosed, prescribed surgery and to be driven long distances, I don't think people are going to trust a robot to financial advice. But I do think that perhaps we can hope that it can address some of the mistakes that we make through education, just the way that Google does, just perhaps a little more tailored.
Yeah, no, certainly one approach of it. Well, thank you so much. I bet our listeners have learned a ton from you now. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So this has been the Financial Thought Exchange podcast. This is the official podcast of the CFA Institute Research Foundation. Thank you for tuning in.
For more information, please visit rpc.cfainstitute.org/research-foundation.